When I first started in the prayer movement, which was about 20 years ago, our son, who was then a young budding physicist trying to get a doctorate in nuclear physics, had quite wide, good honors, great honors. He is a bright boy. I say he has a smart mother, an intelligent mother, and but he is a very, very highly educated and highly intelligent boy. He is a nuclear physicist. Cosmic ray is his field, and that's one of the most difficult. But he said to me, "Dad, if you believe that prayer is power," and I said, "No, wait a minute, I don't believe prayer is power. I believe that prayer releases power." Well, he said, it's all the same thing. He said, if prayer releases power, then he said, you can study it like you'd study electricity. Now, I will have to admit that I had always had religion in one pocket and physics in another pocket, and they weren't the same. And I thought that there was a different set of rules for one and for the other. But he said that is not true. He said, if God is power, and if power comes from God, then every phase of power will work by the same laws. It cannot be otherwise, or it's not a universe. Now that shook me. I backed off and gulped and listened. And Jim has taught me more how prayer works than all the books of prayer I've read, and I have one of the greatest libraries in America on prayer. Anybody can publish a book and put the word prayer in the title, I'll buy it. That's just about the way it is. I gave away 1,300 books out of my library last year, and I have a wall full yet. I said to him, "Jim, what is power?" And he said, "Power is energy in motion." Now, I want you to get this, because this is very important, basic to everything I'm going to say tonight. I always thought that energy and power were somewhat the same thing. He said, "No, that's not so. There's a very great difference, and I want you to get this tonight." He said, "You may store up energy in a battery or in a powerhouse, but you can't store up power." Now get this, because energy is not power until it's doing something and being used up. It's not power as it sits in a battery. It's power when the battery is connected to a motor and the motor runs. Then it's power. And he said you can tell whether there is great power or little power being used by the rate it's being used up. If there's a lot of power being used up in a hurry, it's a lot of power going over that circuit. If there is not very much going, then it's weak power, and of course that made sense to me too. I began to listen to this and began to put it together with my Bible. I found some passages that I want to bring to you tonight. Not all, this isn't all by any means, but this is a skeleton of it. In 2 Samuel 22 and 33, it says, "God is my strength and power." Now, we'd all accept that, but let's go on. Psalm 62 and 11 said, "God has spoken. Twice I have heard this, that power belongeth unto God." Now, I'm trying to say to you tonight that you have no power. I am literally burned up, if I may use that expression, with people talking about other people who have power. They don't have such thing, and I want to show it tonight. Now, there's one passage in the Bible that if you don't understand what it's in, you could think it denies what I'm saying. There had been a disciples, and they'd gone out in a tour, and boy, they'd had everything happen that should happen to good disciples on that road. They came back just walking on air like CFO people do when the camp's over. Just walk home on air, not even touching the ground. Jesus said to them, "Behold, I give you power." Now, that sounds as if they have power, doesn't it? But if you read on, it says, "It give you power over all the power of the enemy." That's activity. That's not settling in a battery. That is activity. That is movement. "Behold, I give you power over," you see. And so he is right. Jesus spake unto them, saying, or in that he said, in that other passage, it goes on to say, marvel not because devils were subject to you and disease left and all these things. Don't marvel because you've had a great few experiences. And this is the word that God is trying to say, I believe, to us tonight. Don't get all excited and hepped up because you've had 2 great experiences of God's power. But rather, be excited because your names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Which means that is always available to me if I'm written in the Book of Life. See? It isn't a spasm for a week or a month or a certain circumstance. It is my relationship to a power and its availability to me as long as my name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. This is what you get excited about, not because you had some great experience or because you prayed and something happened. Now, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4 and 7, the New English translation, we are no better than pots of earthenware to contain this treasure. And this proves that such transcendent power does not come from us, but is God's alone. It is God's. Philippians 4 and 13, I have strength for anything through him who gives me the power. Isn't that tremendous? I have strength for anything through him who gives me the power. And I love James 5 and 16. This just tickles me. I love this. Tremendous power. Isn't that great? Tremendous power is made available when a righteous man prays. And righteous doesn't mean goody-goody. Righteous means I stand before God with all my faults, as we heard this morning, with all my faults and failures. I stand as righteous before God. Why? Because Christ stands in my stead. It's Christ's righteousness which is imputed to me, not my righteousness at all. You see, if you really knew your scriptures, there is no place for a big head in Christianity. Yet we've got a lot of them. We have some sore heads too, but we have a lot of big heads. Dr. Frank Laubach wrote a book after the atomic bomb had been exploded, which was man's greatest touching of power, and he said, call it prayer, the mightiest force in the world. Now that was something, wasn't it? And lots of people say, well, I wonder if that's true. No, wait a minute. The greatest atomic explosion that man has ever done or ever even dreamed of, if you dropped it on New York City, wouldn't touch Los Angeles. But I can pray in New York and see a result in Los Angeles in a second. I can sit here and pray for my friends in India, and something happens. So prayer is the mightiest force of the word. It literally is a releasing, and I believe that prayer is the releasing of divine energy into situations in our sphere or in our world, whatever you want to call it. Now, we might ask ourselves, and someone said to me, well, where does the power of electricity go when the lights go out? Just where yours does. I said to Jim, where does the power go when the lights go out? He said, I don't know. And he's a scientist. He said, you know that this power is so strong and so fast that when you call for it, it is there in full force. And when you have no more need of it, there's none there at all. That shows why you don't have any left over after you've had a great experience. You may have been high today, but tomorrow you may be flat as a pancake. Why? Because there's no power going through you. It's God's power, not ours, remember? We don't have it to store up. It's God's power. So, and power is energy moving. So you and I have to be doing something, or we don't have a bit of God's power. That's a little bit deflating, isn't it? But that's exactly true. By the way, I had a problem on this for many years, and I said to Jim, I wish you'd solve one of my problems. He said, well, if I can. I said, supposing I have a candelabra sitting here like we used to have in every parlor 20 years ago with 3 lights. I don't know why they always had 3, but they always had 3 bright lights. I said, if I put in a 10-watt bulb in one light, now, wait a minute, I'm going too far here. We know there's only one source. You're not hooked up to 3 or 4 powerhouses. You're hooked up to one powerhouse through this circuit. And there's only one circuit, a wire going out and back, one circuit to that candelabra. But I have 3 outlets. Now, isn't it a strange thing that if I put a 10-watt bulb in one outlet, I get 10 watts? If I put in a 50-watt bulb in the next one, I get 50 watt out of the same source and the same circuit. Now, that's a little bit peculiar, isn't it, see? And I made a horrible mistake one night by saying, if I put 1,000 watt in the next one, and a man yelled out, you'll blow a fuse. How right he was. I don't say it anymore. If I put in 100 watt, 10, 50, 100, I get exactly what. And I said, I can't understand that. The same circuit, the same source. You get all kinds. Oh, he said there's a law that covers that. These laws get me. He said there's a law that covers that. He said the amount of energy going over a circuit at any given time is exactly equal to the load asked for. Now hang on to your seats. I ask for 25, I get 25. I put in 50 watts, which is an asking for 50, I get 50. I put in 100, I get 100. Isn't that strange? That's a law of physics, my friend, and it's a law of spiritual power. The Bible says he will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able to bear, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape. Now, let me give that. That's according to King James. Let me give you according to Reg. It's much easier. Who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able to bear, but with the temptation will provide enough power to win if you ask for it. 15, 25, 50. You know, I don't have to run around all steamed up like some people do. Always keyed up, you know. Never letting down. Oh, you got to be on a froth. I don't have to be that way. Do you know why? Because if I have a little temptation that comes along as the Lord, 10 watt will do it. And if I have a bigger temptation as the Lord, 25. And if I get a real hot one, like the Lord will take 100, I get it exactly what I ask for. Now, folks, that did something to me, one of the richest things I've ever found that had to do with power. I don't have to walk around the world trying to screw myself up and keep myself up in power. I can float around. Like I said, and God told me to say it to a group in Boston one time, a little activist group who were very unhappy because their activity wasn't producing a new church. You know, a changed church. And God said to me right in the middle of one of my talks, tell those people to sit down on God. God isn't going to move. Just sit down on it. Take your time. Wait, God may move tomorrow. Don't be all excited because you've got to get it done today. Just sit down on God and let him move. And that's a great truth. I've already anticipated that, this next one, which says that power is never resident. It never stays in the conductor. Now, I didn't know this, and I checked on this to find out. Any electricians in the group here? Hooray! Now, you'll know what I'm talking about there. I checked on this, and they tell me that if the switch is on and everything else, the power's all right, and you unscrew the bulb, which is taking away the call for power, there is no electricity in that wire. I didn't know that. I thought it was a full of wire, full of power, ready to come out. No, it isn't. See? No, there's no electricity at all. And you see why you feel so flat sometimes? I hope I help some of you people around here tonight. I'm sure you get flat like I do. I'm sure you do. But you see, when power is going through, you're blessed. And there's another thing. Whenever power moves through a conductor, it not only passes through or over, and they don't know which yet, do they? Some say one, some say the other. They don't, but whenever power passes through a conductor, it not only goes in the conductor, but it energizes a field around it. I see the electricians nodding their heads here. It energizes a field around it. Let me illustrate what I'm trying to say. When you drive down in the car, as I did coming down here, and the car, the radio's running off nice music, you know, if you can find any, but running off with nice music, quiet, and all of a sudden it begins to chatter, 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 it gets worse, 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 and then it gets less, 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 and finally it's way back music again. You didn't touch the dial, you didn't do a thing in the world, but you came under a high-tension wire, and that high-tension wire is a field, a circuit, a field. So it was weak out here, and it got stronger and stronger and stronger, and then weaker and weaker and weaker as you went out. You see? Now, I want to tell you people something. I hope some of you listen to this. Every one of us have been troubled and beat ourselves when we're not full of power. I want to give you the simplest form of how you can be full of power and how you can get rid of these downs, if you'll do it. And it's the simplest thing in the world. Now remember, whenever power goes through a conductor, it not only energizes the conductor, but a field around it. Okay, if I do as simple a thing, say I've been to a big meeting last night, and everybody was high, and they shouted and yelled and screamed and did all kinds of crazy things, and had a good time doing it. And then tomorrow, I'm not with that crowd, and I'm out in the troubles of life, and I get real cold and flat. Boy, you can get flat. But let me tell you something. And then you pray, and you can't pray. And you try to pray, and God isn't around. And you wonder, what in the world has happened? If you will go out and do a simple, kind deed to anybody that needs it, and let God's power flow through you, you will become energized instantaneously. All you've got to do is pick up the telephone and talk to some poor soul that nobody ever calls. Be sure you get that kind, because they'll receive a lot of power. And you can do it. Well, we laugh about this, about baking a cake for somebody. That's the same thing. If you do anything to bless one of God's children, and God sends His power through you, you are energized yourself. That's why you feel so good when you've done something nice. You see? You feel so good, and you feel so rotten when you've done something bad, as bad power's been going through you. Now then, what I'm saying here is, God does not give any of us power as a possession. And all of us have been guilty of telling, oh, this man's got power, this woman's got power, or at times feeling, I've got power. I remember a man, a very dear friend of mine, but he was in his early stages of growth. And he had a fantastic experience with God, and I don't doubt the experience for 1 minute. But that man became so puffed up that he ran all around through the prayer groups in his city the next 2 weeks, saying to people, don't touch me, you get hurt, I'm full of power. Man, I wish I'd have been there. I would have made a flying tackle and hit him right in the middle. I'd have grabbed him with all fours. And I wouldn't expect to have been blown up either. You see, the poor man thought that God gave him some power, it was his. And that he had it all boxed up inside, And if anybody touched him, they were going to get hurt. And that's not the way God's power works either, by the way. Anyway, Jesus gave us this story beautifully in the vine and the branches. How simple can it be? As long as you stay connected, and as long as you're growing grapes out here, the juice will come up from down and out through the branch, out the vine, out, and finding grapes. But you cut it off, and you can't do a thing. You can't do a thing if you cut it off. See? Boy, nobody ever saw you produce grapes on a dead branch. Nobody ever did. It's got to be hooked up, as we might say. Now listen, so our real power is not to seek power, but it's to seek the connection. Now I'm going to come back to that a minute ago, so let it go ahead. Now the loss of power is something we need to learn. Every one of us at times have had great power, as we say, and every one of us have at times just wondered where the power was, like the bumper sticker, the sign they say, if you don't feel God around, who has moved? And I think that's a good bumper sticker. It's much better than some I see. Now, the loss of power, I'm referring to that one, honk if you love Jesus, and I've honked and got the dirtiest looks you ever... Don't put that on my bumper sticker. First of all, Jim said, loss of power can come from such a simple thing as poor connections. Wrong ideas about Christ, not reading your Bible, not learning what God has said, not knowing what God has taught is a wrong connection, because you feel you're hooked up to something, but you're hooked up to the wrong idea, and the wrong idea of God, and this doesn't work. And then it can be too small a conductor. Jim took me down to the laboratory where he was studying there at Case, in a laboratory that was so immaculate that you had to take your shoes off to go in. You couldn't carry any dust, and it was the air was purified every 6 minutes, because this little small speck of dust could get into some of those highly technical instruments that they were using in space. And he took me over to a big gondola. It was about 4 feet wide and about 4 feet deep, about pretty near a cube of styrofoam, which would be encased, of course, in something else before it was set up. But this was where the way it was in the shop or in the lab. And each professor had his own little things that they were going to put in there to shoot off into space and testing, making tests. And Jim he and some other people had invented a little machine which was fantastic and had never been done in the world before, but a little machine which learned a lot of things about cosmic ray that man had never known before. Part of this little machine was a little camera which would shoot out highly sensitive plates into the stratosphere for a split second or whatever timing they had, and then pull it back into a lead sheet and be closed in it so nothing else could make a mark on it. And they took these things, they just piled up and stacked them. He showed me a stack of them about this high. And he said, now, if it's way over here, this side, a little more, they could tell exactly the angle of that cosmic ray by looking at those things, you see. And there was a lot of things they were doing. But anyway, he said, we had this camera, and we had tested it, and it worked every time. And it took 6 volts to run it. I said, we had checked that thing on the table over and over again, and everything went, just punch it, bing, she'd run, you know. But he said, when we went to put it in, there was one place the camera had to go because the little lens, it wasn't a lens really, it was a projection thing, had to have a hole. They called it a port, but it looked a hole to me. But anyway, there was a hole in the side of the gondola where this thing had to stick out through, you see. And then there wasn't room enough. Some other of the scientists had put things too near that port, and he had room to take his old battery. So he had to go across a couple of feet and wire in his battery. Well, that was no trouble. So he put it in and wired it up and went back to the desk and gave it the impulse. Didn't work. And man, they tried and they tried and they tried. And then Jim looked at me and he said, you know, 2 scientists that ought to know something should never have been so dumb as to spend a half a day trying to find out what was wrong. He said, after we had tried and took the camera out, it worked. We took the battery out, tested it right, everything. Just wouldn't work. And he said, finally, we took the battery in, put it back in, or the camera in, put it back in, put the battery back in, and we tested the energy at the battery, 6 volts. But when we gave it the impulse at the camera and tested it, 4.5 volts. They were losing 1.5 volts in line loss, you see, and didn't know it. Now, he said, when we cut that off and went to a 16-gauge wire, and that's a big wire, isn't it, for 6 volts. That's really a great big one. But it wasn't. Put in a 16-gauge wire and went back to the desk and give bingo. No line loss. Now, listen, folks. I hope you'll never forget this. Isn't it entirely possible that God has tried to help somebody through us and has sent down the exact amount of power, and we were too small a conductors to give love like we should have, and it didn't come out the way it should have? That'll kind of hurt you a bit. That has hurt me many times, I've thought of that. It really has. So Jim says you've got to have a big enough conductor if the power is going to go through without any loss. Now then. And then he said he took up a pair of pliers off the bench and he struck this maze of wires, hundreds of them all. He just struck one, and I said, Jim, why, you might break some of those wires. And he laughed. And he said, Dad, if those wires can be broken, we want them broken. If those connections aren't strong enough to stand a blow with milo pliers, they'll likely break when we shoot them off into the stratosphere under great pressure. And then we lose 6 months of labor, and our whole experiment is lost. He said, if they can be broken, we want them broken. Now, let me give you an implication here to our lives. Have it ever happened to you? This sure has happened to me. When God had a job to do, and I wanted to do it, you know, we all like to do these things for God, you know, and get a little self-glory, of course, but we all want to do it. And somebody else has been chosen instead of me. I wonder if God put me on the bench and tested me. I wonder if he struck me a blow with some uncouth creature. It had to be, you know, to hurt us. But somebody that didn't understand, and they didn't understand, man, they hurt you, and you reacted just like an ordinary person. And God said, I'm sorry, Reg, I can't use you in this beat. And he'd get over here and give it to Paul. Now, you know he shouldn't do that. I should have had it, see, because I'm so much better, Well, we think that, don't we? I hope you get that point, folks. When God has a job to do, he's very apt to test us. And if we are not the kind that can take testing, God cannot use us in his wisdom. All right. Now then, I think there's another thing we want to realize the fact is, and that is, and this, a man gave me this just recently. He came up to me and he said, I've got a point for your sermon. I said, great, I've got all the rest of them from layman, I can take another. He said, did it ever dawn on you that there is something about power? Of course, scientists take light, they don't differentiate between light and power because it's all a form of power to them. It's energy on the move. And he said, it never dawned on you that energy seems to always be wanting to work. Okay, you flip the switch, and you don't sit there and beg the power to come through. It's already through before you can bat an eye. It wants to go. Now listen, if Jesus is the light of the world, and this is a law of light, you don't have to beg God to do good things. And I hear people doing it everywhere I go. Please, God, I'm begging God. You don't have to beg God. Let me give you an illustration that every one of you understand. Suppose then that you are in your bedroom at home, and the blind is pulled down, and the room's all dark. How are you going to make the room light? Now, I'm not talking about electricity here. I'm talking about natural light. How are you going to get natural light into that room? By going downtown and getting a few cubic feet of light and dump it in the room? No, you simply raise the blind. The light is already at the outside, listen to this, pressuring to come in. If we could see the power of God so available that all I have to do is take away the obstructions, and the power will flow without me asking, begging, crying, doing a single thing. Isn't that fantastic? I would work half as hard at being a Christian today as I used to. And I'm a better Christian. I've learned to let the light in. I've learned to let the power flow instead of begging God to do it, and quoting Scripture to him, which, of course, he doesn't know until I do it. But anyway, the next thing I'd like to say about power is this. You cannot buy it. You cannot buy spiritual power. You remember Simon the sorcerer who had been making his living by fooling people with sorcery and all kinds of magic? Now, lest somebody says, but Simon wasn't a good Christian. Wait a minute. My Bible says that Simon believed and was converted and was baptized. Any church who wouldn't accept him? No, I don't think so. I know the Methodists would glad to take him in. He believed, he was converted, and was baptized. I don't know any other requirement. Do you? For getting into the kingdom? I don't know any other. So Simon was a Christian. But when Simon saw the apostles laying hands on people and the Holy Spirit coming to them, man, he said, man, I got to have this. You see, he was another Peter that way. I got to have this. So he goes up to Peter and says, Peter, how much does this cost? That's exactly what he said. How much does this cost? Now, Peter was a rough boy. Boy, you had to watch where you played with him. Peter turned to him and he said, I perceive that you're in the gall of bitterness. Poor old Peter. He couldn't be halfway if he wanted to, could he? He either had to be all out or none. He said, I perceive you're in the gall of bitterness and savorest not the things of God. Repent of this feeling, lest something terrible befall you. I know thousands of good Christians who think God has to take them in because of the good deeds they do. And non-Christians the same. How many thousands of non-Christians in every city in America who say, oh, I don't so bad. I don't, and I do a lot of good things. I help my neighbor, you know, and I do all these things, you know. I'm all right. I don't need salvation. That's not what it says. You cannot buy it. Now, let me summarize and give you a few illustrations. First of all, one person. Oh, thank God. Thank God you don't have to have a crowd. One person can be an utterly fantastic channel for God's power. Elijah, we talked about him the other night, against the prophets of Baal, all alone. Didn't even have a committee. He wasn't a Methodist. Of course, he was a Baptist. Look at the way he poured the water around there. But I guess nobody gets mad when we have fun, do they? One person. Let me tell you a beautiful story. In our last pastorate, there came to our town 2 young men, oil engineers. And they were really had found, they really came into a tremendous experience with God, and they just got all excited. They just had to do something big for God, and that's good. And so they decided, the 4 of them, the 2 men and their wives, that at that time the oil companies were crying for people to go abroad and work, you know, at high pay for them. And they said, if the 4 of us would go across, both the ladies were secretaries and we'd get almost double pay over there, and they could go at almost double pay. And since they weren't the kind that were going to squander their money in riotous living, that if the 4 people could put together their money, in a few years they could come home with a nice nest egg. Do you know what they wanted the nest egg for? To build an orphanage for children. Wasn't that beautiful? They wanted to give the rest of their lives to God. Now, off they went to Saudi Arabia, way out in the desert, in the middle of the, not in the middle of Sahara, but out in the desert, where they were shut off from everybody. And things went on. Dan and his buddy sent us some letters, but not very much. They were busy people. But one day I got a letter, which is in my private little cherished box out of all my goodies of the ministry. One of the beautiful things. And Dan Edwards said, Reg, I don't know why we haven't written off, or we have been busy, and you know that. But he said, something happened yesterday I had to write. I've got to tell you. He said, you know, whenever anybody goes out from the compound in the desert, we know who's in the vehicle, what vehicle it is, how much petrol or gasoline they have, how much food, how much water. We know how long those men can live in the desert without any help or contact with us. So he said, we have intercoms, and we have a great big bulletin board on the side of the wall, and every vehicle outside the compound is put there, and there are men sitting there watching the progress of those things. 2 men had gone out and had never come back. The time was getting pretty short that those men could exist in the desert. He said, everything became tight. And he said, we sent out things, we did everything we could do. We couldn't find hide nor hair. Not a sign of them. And we even called in the army, and we crisscrossed in a pattern the whole desert where they were, and not a sign of those men. The desert had literally swallowed them up. He said, everybody became tense and tight. And he said, men began to curse and swear as they do, you know, in those situations. And he said, I came in with my driver from a run, and he said, I came in, the room was almost just, you could hardly hear people. Intercoms barking and men swearing and cursing going on. And he said, something hit me. And I sat down at the table with a sandwich in my hand and a cup of coffee, and somebody said to me, Dan Edwards, why haven't you prayed? And he said, Reg, I can't understand why I didn't. I just don't know why I hadn't. Because he's a praying man. He said, I put my head down in my hands right amidst all that cursing and blasphemy and everything else. I just put my face between my hands. I didn't care who saw me. And I said, dear God, those men are going to die. Help us to find them. Thank you, Father. Got up, didn't even drink his coffee, took his sandwich, went out the door, and the Jeep, he was just driving up to pick him up. He got into the Jeep, and without getting a pattern or being told where to go or saying anybody where to go, they just started driving into the desert. Just started driving into the desert. And he said, you know, they hadn't gone any more than 15 miles. Then suddenly he called a halt because there in front of him was about 2 feet of a track. Now, they knew the kind of a track it ought to be because they knew what vehicle it was. And they could tell which direction the thing was going by the track, by the pattern. He said, we got down on our knees and examined it, and we knew, though we had no proof it was, because these vehicles were always going across the desert, But he said, it could be. It was the same kind of a track and the same kind of a vehicle. And he said, so we started to cross the desert. And he said, we'd pick up another piece. We'd go a mile or two and pick up another few inches or a foot of a track. And he said, Reg, our vehicle went as straight across that desert as though there had been a reel attached to the front of our raider and was just reeling us in. Just straight right, ding, right across. And he said, lo and behold, we came up against a cliff in the desert where there was an overhang of an outcropping, an overhang. And he said, those men, knowing they couldn't stand the sun much longer, had driven the Jeep as far as they could possibly get it, way up in, under the thing, and they were lying in there almost exhausted. And he said the airplanes were going over the top of them, and they hadn't enough life left to call them or get out, and nobody could see them. Now, he said, Reg, I don't care what anybody says. I believe that God answered my prayer. You see, one person, it's fantastic what one person can be. Yet we sit around thinking we've got to have groups. That isn't so. However, let's not forget the fact that groups do help. Peter, in jail, they'd already killed one of the apostles, and they kind of thought maybe they're going to take him next day too. Please the mob, you know. And those days life was pretty cheap. This little band of prayer-meet got together and barred the doors and went to prayer. And pretty soon Peter was knocking on the door. Just a little group, you see. Now, churches, one church, and I'm not trying to brag tonight. I gave this a story about this, how prayer changed the whole city, and didn't know that I had 3 people in the audience who had been to our town and knew all about these churches, and they came up after and said, boy, you sure told the truth. I saw 2 women get together. Then it increased to 4. It never got above 6. But I saw a whole city change for God. The school system and evil and sin went out of it like sweeping it with a broom. The police department, the city council, the school board, which was rotten to the core. And I saw all of those things change, plus the fact that every major denomination in that town had to build a new church. And you can go today and see them. They're there. After the prayer movement started. All from 2 women. Gentlemen and ladies, we're missing the boat. We're missing the boat. If prayer is this powerful, we ought to be changing the world. Because the power is there. And remember, the power equal to what you ask for is available. Isn't that tremendous? All right. Nations can be powerful for God. It wasn't too long ago when England ruled the 7 seas. It isn't too very long ago. And they tell us that the sun never set with what it said on the British flag. And Britain was sending out missionaries all over the world, you know. Somebody said that the first time they take a commercial load to the moon, there'll be missionaries on it. And I think perhaps there would be. But that's the way we are. But England started sending missionaries where those boats were not. But when that began to close down, and men got concerned about dollars and the riches in those countries and bringing them back for England, and it became less and less and less a part of missionaries, England started down. Now, don't you forget, this is history. And England started down. And today, listen to this. I read this in Forbes magazine just the other day, that if the Arab money were pulled out of the banks in England, England would collapse in 24 hours as a nation. That's how far down she is. Less than 50 years ago, she cast that torch of leadership of the world to whom? To America, another Christian nation. But let me tell you something that I don't like to tell you. I'm a Methodist, proud of it and ashamed of it. For there are less Methodist missionaries in the world today than there was the day I was born. And that's tragic. And our church is going down, and nobody can deny it. We're not even keeping up with the population. Something's happened. What am I saying to you today? I am saying this, that God has available the power to do everything that you and I could see that needs to be done in this world. He's got to have conductors, pure conductors. That's why our prayer groups are not gimme groups that we teach. Our prayer groups are so that people are transformed into the kind of people God can use, not gimme groups. Sure, they ask some requests. So I believe that when it comes to power, we need to realize that it's not the big shots, and I'm saying this meaningfully right now to our blessing service, our healing service. It is not us who are supposedly leaders, and I've been bugged all week with this sign on here which says leader. I wish they had put speaker on that. I'd liked it a lot better. Every time I walk around, I thought, what's a leader? You know, and I think other people ask the same thing. But we're going to pray for those who need physical help tonight. Now, let me clarify this. Tomorrow morning, you're going to take communion. And if you know anything about the communion of the Lord's Supper, by taking the bread and the wine, the symbols of the life and the body of Jesus, there's healing there. There is tremendous healing in the Lord's Supper. If we could only teach our people that monthly or whatever it may be, as they come to the Lord's table, they should expect an infusion of the power of Jesus' blood into their body as well as their lives. That's right. So there will be another chance tomorrow morning. Then toward the end of the camp, there will be a blessing service in which we will lay hands, I suppose the council ring or generally or something like that, will lay hands on you, and they will not ask for what you may be asking. They will ask God to give you what He sees you need to go home. Again, there's place for healing, isn't there? Physical as well as spiritual. But tonight we have been asked to narrow it down to those who have individual needs in a physical way tonight. And I believe with this group of here, as we talk tonight, if each of us can be even minor channels of God's power, we should be able to heal every person that would come up. On the other hand, it isn't always necessary to make a show of your need, and some people are very reticent about this. It may be that some of you don't want to come and sit in a chair. Will you put up 2 chairs while I'm talking, Paul? Just set 2 chairs right here. It may be that some of you feel a little reticent about coming and saying, I have a physical need. Now, I don't think, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I don't believe that any one of us are here. And we're not asking that you differentiate completely between mind and body. I don't know who can make that division except God. But we are asking people to come, not in general tonight at all. That comes later. But to those who have a specific need, and listen, let me ask you to come specifically for a specific need. Now, I'm going to give you a lecture Saturday morning. I guess I'm on Saturday morning. If I am, I'm going to show you why and how prayer works in this very area and the laws that govern this very thing. That's why we're only going to pray for one person at a time. And that's why we're narrowing it down tonight, so we won't have a host of people. We want time for us to lay hands on these one person, and you folk are simply to offer yourself as channels of God's power for that person and whatever need they have in their body tonight. Now, my friends, if you do this, and if you let God have His way, God is going to work miracles tonight. He literally is. Now, will you come on up, and maybe you want to say something too. I'd be glad if you would on this part of the healing. We do not, at least I don't want to know what your need is. God knows. And so when you come, I'm not going to ask you what your need is. I'm going to pray God to bless your need. Go ahead.
I think Reg has given us such a wonderful launching pad here. And I would just like to say this. He has said it in so many words, but do not look to Reg and me.
Oh.
We're not reservoirs, we're
That's
just
right.
conduits, and you're conduits. And when you come, expect something to happen to you, not because we lay hands on you, although that may be a point of contact, as they say. Mm-hmm. Expect Jesus to confirm his word with signs following as we do this. We're in divine order.
That's right. That is right. Now, let me add to what she reminded me of something. I knew I was forgetting something, and you reminded me of it. What you people do is far more important than what she and I do.
Yes. Amen.
I mean that, folks. I really do. I am saying to you tonight that with 75 or 80 people who believe, even if there's a few who don't, if there's 75 people here tonight to offer themselves as channels for God, something very tremendous is going to happen. It really is. Now, I was going to give you, and I have in my notes, a bunch of scriptures to read to you. I'm not going to do it tonight. I don't think we need it. I really don't. I don't think the most of us have to be proven that God heals, or that God can heal, or that God has promised to heal. I don't think we need it, do we? No. Not at the CFO camp. It does us good if we have time to strengthen our minds. But I'm not going to do that tonight. We're simply going to offer ourselves as channels for whatever you may need tonight. And when we've prayed and when we take our hands off your head, you arise from your chair and go back to your seat. At the same time, somebody else can come and sit in the chair until we're ready, and we will move to the other person, and we'll move along rapidly that way. Now, before we do, there are some things you must do. If there's anything between you and anybody else, let's get rid of it before you come to this chair. If you do not forgive your brother, Jesus said, your heavenly Father will not hear your prayers. If there's anything between you and your fellow men, we're going to take time and we're going to have a minute or two of meditation. And if you can't do it tonight, which you likely can't, promise God you'll take care of it when you go home. A letter, a phone call, maybe a visit. Who knows? Whatever it may be. But just promise God that you will clear the deck tonight and that you're coming here as far as you know in a perfect, complete, clean union with God. And there's nothing between. If there's sin in your life and you don't want to give it up, I don't think I'd bother coming. I really don't. Known sin I'm talking about now. Things that you really know.
Unrepented of.
Yes, right. If you do. But, again, I don't want to put negatives in here too much. We want you to come, but be sure that in a moment of silence we have here, and I'm going to ask our pianist, if you will, play something. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Perhaps would be as good as anything. I'm sure you can do that without any books. Let's quiet ourselves, close our eyes, be in meditation.